There are many ways for a Roman legion to die. It can be ambushed in a forest, like the legions of Varus in the Teutoburg. It can be annihilated in battle, like Crassus's army at Carrhae. It can be starved, besieged, or betrayed. But there is one way that no Roman general ever planned for, one enemy that no training manual ever addressed, one humiliation so complete that the empire itself conspired to forget it ever happened. A Roman legion, or at least a significant detachment of one, effectively vanished in the mountains of Asia Minor, not because it was defeated by a superior army, not because it was outmaneuvered by brilliant tactics, but because it was destroyed by bees. This is not a legend. This is not folklore embellished over centuries. This is a disaster that actually occurred, preserved in fragments of ancient texts, scattered references in military correspondence, and the stubborn oral traditions of mountain tribes who remembered the day they defeated Rome with insects.
The exact identity of the legion remains uncertain. No official Roman record proudly declares Legio X was decimated by bees in 88 BC. That would have been too embarrassing, too absurd, too damaging to the empire's carefully constructed image of invincibility. Instead, we have gaps. We have vague mentions in the writings of Appian and Strabo about disasters in Pontus and losses to unconventional warfare. We have references to units that appear in military rosters one year and vanish the next, their numbers absorbed into other legions without explanation. We have local stories passed down through generations in the villages of what is now northern Turkey about the day the mountains fought back and the Romans ran screaming. The region where this disaster unfolded was and remains brutally inhospitable. The Pontic Mountains of Asia Minor rise sharply from the Black Sea coast, their slopes covered in dense forests, their valleys narrow and treacherous. This was not the open plains of Gaul, where Roman formations could maneuver freely. This was not the deserts of Africa, where visibility stretched for miles. This was terrain that favored defenders, where every ridge could hide an ambush, where every gorge became a potential trap, and it was full of bees. The mountains of Asia Minor were, and still are, home to some of the most aggressive bee species in the ancient world. Wild hives clung to cliff faces, tucked into rocky overhangs, hidden in hollow trees. These were not the docile honeybees of modern apiaries. These were Apis mellifera and italica, a subspecies known for its defensive aggression, its willingness to swarm at the slightest provocation, and its ability to pursue threats for hundreds of meters. Local tribes had lived alongside these bees for centuries. They understood their behavior. They knew how to harvest honey without being killed. And crucially, they knew how to weaponize them. The political context that brought Roman soldiers into this nightmare was simple: rebellion. The tribes of the Pontic interior, groups like the Heptacomates and the Chalybes, had refused to pay tribute to Rome. They had attacked tax collectors, killed Roman merchants, and declared themselves independent of imperial authority. This was intolerable. Rome did not negotiate with mountain tribes. Rome sent legions.
The expedition was meant to be a punishment campaign, a show of force designed to terrify the locals into submission. A detachment of Roman infantry, supported by auxiliary cavalry and supply trains, was dispatched into the mountains with clear orders: burn villages, seize livestock, execute ringleaders, and remind everyone within 100 miles that Rome was not to be defied. But Rome had underestimated its enemy, not the tribes themselves. Roman soldiers were trained to fight human opponents, and they were very good at it. The problem was that the tribes had no intention of fighting Rome on Roman terms. They would not march out in formation. They would not engage in pitched battles. They would not give the Romans the clean, honorable conflict that Roman military doctrine was designed to win. Instead, they would use the mountains and the bees. The psychological hook of this story is simple and terrifying. How could elite soldiers, men trained to face cavalry charges, spear walls, and burning oil, be overwhelmed by insects? How could a fighting force that had conquered half the known world be reduced to chaos by creatures that weighed less than a denarius?
The answer lies not in military science, but in psychology. A soldier can steel himself against human enemies. He can control his fear when facing swords, arrows, or siege engines, because those are threats he understands. But insects are different. They are everywhere and nowhere. They do not negotiate. They do not retreat. They do not die when you stab them. And when they come in swarms, when they fill the air with their buzzing rage, when they crawl inside your armor and sting your face, your neck, your eyes, there is no formation, no training, no discipline that can save you. The Romans were about to learn this the hard way.
The tribes of the Pontic Mountains did not invent biological warfare, but they perfected one of its strangest applications. They had lived in these valleys for generations, harvesting wild honey, avoiding angry swarms, and observing the behavior of bees with the kind of practical expertise that comes from necessity. They knew which hives were docile and which were aggressive. They knew which seasons made the bees most defensive. They knew how smoke calmed them, how fire enraged them, and how the right provocation could turn a peaceful hive into a flying weapon. This knowledge was not theoretical, it was survival. A farmer who disturbed a hive carelessly could be stung to death. A child who threw stones at bees for fun might trigger a swarm that endangered an entire village. Over time, the tribes developed techniques to manage these dangers, rituals, tools, and traditions designed to coexist with an environment that was as deadly as it was valuable. But coexistence became something else when Rome arrived. When the legions marched into the mountains, burning villages and seizing crops, the tribes realized they needed more than bows and spears. They needed something Rome had never faced before, something Rome could not armor against, something that would turn the empire's greatest strength, its disciplined, heavily armored infantry, into a liability. They needed bees. The method was ingenious in its simplicity. The tribes identified the most aggressive hives in the region, swarms that had already proven their willingness to attack, and marked their locations. Then, they crafted clay pots, sealed them loosely, and carefully transported sections of hives into these containers. Some sources suggest they used smoke to temporarily calm the bees during this process, though this would have been extraordinarily dangerous work. Others propose that they simply enclosed entire wild hives in woven baskets or ceramic jars, leaving them undisturbed until the moment of attack. The tribes then identified the perfect battlefield, narrow gorges where Roman formations would be forced to compress, where escape routes were limited, and where the cliffs on either side were dotted with natural hives. These were not randomly chosen ambush sites. They were calculated traps designed to maximize chaos and minimize the Romans' ability to respond.
The use of animals and insects as weapons was not unique to the Pontic tribes. History is full of examples. The Carthaginians famously used war elephants, creatures whose size and aggression terrified Roman soldiers until the legions learned to counter them. The Scythians poisoned their arrows with venom extracted from snakes.
Persian armies reportedly drove herds of livestock ahead of their formations to create dust clouds and confusion. Even bees had been weaponized before. There are accounts of ancient Greek cities defending themselves by throwing beehives at besieging forces. But what made the Pontic tribes' use of bees so effective was the context. They were not defending walls. They were not fighting on open ground. They were luring Rome into a terrain where every advantage the legions possessed, armor, discipline, formation tactics, became meaningless. In the narrow mountain passes, there was no room to maneuver. In the chaos of a bee swarm, there was no way to maintain formation. And against an enemy that could fly inside your helmet, sting your face, and drive you into blind panic, there was no such thing as bravery. Bees were the perfect guerrilla weapon. They were silent until activated. They required no training to deploy. They were cheap. Wild hives cost nothing to harvest. They were unpredictable, which made them terrifying. And most importantly, they exploited a weakness that Roman armor inadvertently created.
Roman legionary armor, the iconic lorica segmentata, along with helmets, greaves, and shields, was designed to protect against bladed weapons, arrows, and blunt trauma. It covered the torso, the head, and parts of the limbs, but it was not sealed. There were gaps at the neck, the joints, the face. And in the heat of Asia Minor's summer, soldiers often loosened straps, removed padding, or adjusted their gear to stay cool. This made them vulnerable in ways they did not anticipate. When a bee swarm attacked, the insects did not bounce harmlessly off bronze plates. They found the gaps. They crawled inside. They stung exposed skin. And once a soldier was stung, especially multiple times, the pain, the swelling, and the psychological shock made it nearly impossible to fight. Soldiers dropped their shields to swat at bees. They tore off their helmets to escape the buzzing inside. They abandoned formation to flee. And in doing so, they made themselves even more vulnerable. The tribes understood this. They had observed Roman soldiers drilling, marching, and camping. They had seen how the legions relied on tight formations, on mutual support, on the psychological comfort of standing shoulder to shoulder with comrades. They knew that if they could break that formation, if they could turn disciplined soldiers into panicked individuals, the Romans would be defenseless. So they prepared their trap. They mapped the gorges. They positioned their hives. They waited for the Romans to march into the perfect killing ground. And when the moment came, they struck with a weapon no Roman general had ever imagined: a storm of bees. The morning the Romans entered the gorge, they had no reason to suspect what was about to happen. The column was standard, infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks, supply wagons in the rear. Scouts had reported no enemy activity ahead. The cliffs on either side were steep, but not impassable. The path was narrow, but the legion had marched through worse. What they did not see, what they could not have seen, were the hives. Dozens of them, clinging to the cliff faces above, hidden in rocky crevices and tucked beneath overhangs. And they did not see the tribesmen, crouched on the ridges above, holding their clay pots, their slings loaded, waiting for the signal. The signal came when the Roman column was fully committed, too deep into the gorge to turn back quickly, too compressed to maneuver effectively. The tribesmen lit small fires, filling their pots with smoke to agitate the bees inside. Then they hurled the pots down into the gorge. The pottery shattered against the rocks. The bees exploded outward.
At first, the Romans did not understand what was happening. There was a sound, a rising, furious hum, and then the air itself seemed to thicken. Thousands of bees, enraged by the smoke and the sudden violence of their release, poured into the gorge. They did not flee, they attacked. The first soldiers to be hit were the cavalry. Horses, with their large, vulnerable eyes and sensitive skin, panicked immediately. They reared, bucked, and bolted. Some threw their riders. Others crashed into the infantry formations, trampling men and scattering equipment. The supply wagons, pulled by mules, suffered the same fate. The animals went mad, overturning carts, spilling grain and weapons across the narrow path, and creating obstacles that trapped the soldiers behind them. The infantry tried to hold formation. Officers shouted orders. Centurions bellowed for discipline. But discipline requires a clear enemy, and there was no clear enemy here. There was only the buzzing, the stinging, the crawling sensation of insects everywhere.
Soldiers began to swat at the air. They dropped their shields. They tore off their helmets, desperate to escape the bees that had crawled inside and were stinging their scalps, their ears, their faces. Some soldiers tried to run, but the gorge was too narrow, too crowded. They collided with their comrades, creating bottlenecks and more chaos. Then the tribesmen added the natural hives. Using long poles, they dislodged the massive wild hives that clung to the cliffs. The hives fell into the gorge, exploding on impact, releasing even more bees. These were not the agitated swarms from the pots. These were fully established colonies, defending their homes with suicidal fury. The sound was unbearable. The buzzing was so loud it drowned out the screams. Soldiers who had never broken in battle, who had faced dramatic war cries and Gallic charges without flinching, were reduced to helpless panic. Some soldiers tried to cover themselves with their cloaks. Others dove into the shallow stream that ran through the gorge, submerging themselves and hoping the bees would disperse. A few soldiers, stung dozens of times, collapsed and were trampled by their retreating comrades.
The heat made everything worse. The summer sun, trapped in the narrow gorge, turned the space into an oven. Soldiers were already sweating inside their armor, already dehydrated from the march. Now, with bees crawling inside their gear, stinging repeatedly, the heat became unbearable. Men ripped off their chest plates, their helmets, their greaves, anything that trapped the insects against their skin. In doing so, they exposed themselves further. Some soldiers tried to fight back. They swung their swords at the air as if they could cut through the swarm. They threw stones upward, hoping to hit the tribesmen on the cliffs. But the bees were everywhere, and the tribesmen were safely out of reach, watching as Rome's elite infantry disintegrated into chaos. The psychological collapse was complete. Roman military discipline, the foundation of the empire's military success, evaporated in minutes. There was no formation, there was no command structure. There was only terror, pain, and the primal instinct to flee. Soldiers pushed past their officers. They abandoned their wounded. They threw down their weapons to run faster. The tribesmen did not need to enter the gorge. They did not need to risk direct combat. They simply waited, watching as the Romans destroyed themselves, trampling one another, suffocating in the press of bodies, falling from the cliffs in their desperation to escape. By the time the survivors stumbled out of the gorge hours later, the legion had ceased to exist as a fighting force. They had been defeated by bees.
The survivors who staggered out of the gorge were barely recognizable as Roman soldiers. Their armor was gone, discarded in the chaos. Their faces were swollen beyond recognition, eyes reduced to slits, skin covered in welts and stings. Some men were delirious from the venom, hallucinating, unable to walk without support. Others were silent, traumatized, staring blankly at nothing. The casualty reports, when they were finally compiled, were devastating. Dozens of men were dead, killed not by bee stings directly, but by the chaos they created. Some had been trampled in the panic. Others had fallen from the cliffs while trying to escape. A few had drowned in the stream, too disoriented to surface. The horses and mules were nearly all lost, either dead or scattered into the mountains. The supply wagons had been overturned, their contents looted by the tribesmen or destroyed in the chaos. But the worst casualties were not physical. They were psychological. The survivors were ashamed. Roman soldiers were trained to endure pain, to face death with courage, to maintain discipline under the worst conditions. But there is no way to be brave against bees. There is no honor in running from insects. The men knew they had broken. They knew they had fled. And they knew that when they returned to camp, when they faced their fellow soldiers, they would be mocked.
They were right. News of the disaster spread quickly through the Roman military. Other legions, stationed in Asia Minor and beyond, heard the story and reacted with a mixture of disbelief and derision. A legion defeated by bees? It sounded like a joke. It sounded like cowardice. Soldiers began calling the survivors the Bee Legion, a nickname that stuck, a label that became a permanent stain on their reputation. The officers tried to minimize the damage. Letters sent back to Rome described the incident in the vaguest possible terms. They spoke of unexpected enemy tactics, difficult terrain, and unconventional warfare. They did not mention bees. To do so would have been to admit that Rome, master of the known world, conqueror of nations, had been humiliated by insects. That admission would have damaged not just the legion, but the empire's reputation. So the details were buried. The incident was not recorded in official histories. It did not appear in triumphal inscriptions or public monuments. It became a rumor, a whispered story, a piece of military folklore that most Romans preferred to forget.
But the soldiers themselves could not forget. The trauma of that day lingered. Men who had survived the bee attack refused to enter forests. They panicked at the sound of buzzing. They flinched when insects flew near them. Some developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, flashbacks, an inability to relax even in safe environments. The legion's morale collapsed. Discipline, once ironclad, became fragile. Soldiers questioned their officers, resented their orders, and whispered mutinous thoughts. The unit's cohesion, the sense of brotherhood and shared purpose that made Roman legions so effective, was shattered. They were no longer a fighting force. They were a collection of traumatized individuals, bound together only by shared humiliation. Attempts to restore discipline failed. Officers threatened punishments. They staged thrills. They appealed to honor, to duty, to the glory of Rome. But how do you inspire men who have been defeated by bees? How do you tell them to be brave when they know, deep in their bones, that bravery is meaningless against an enemy that crawls inside your armor?
The legion never recovered. Within months, the survivors were quietly reassigned to other units. The legion's numbers were absorbed into neighboring legions. Its standards were retired. Its name disappeared from the records. For all practical purposes, the unit ceased to exist, not because it had been destroyed in battle, but because it had been erased by embarrassment. This, perhaps, is the saddest part of the story. The men who survived the bee attack were not cowards. They were experienced soldiers who had fought in other campaigns, who had endured hardships that would break most people. but they had faced something Rome was not prepared for. An enemy that exploited vulnerabilities the empire did not know it had, and instead of being honored for their survival, they were mocked, dismissed, and forgotten. The tribesmen, meanwhile, celebrated. They had defeated Rome, not with superior numbers, not with better weapons, but with cleverness and knowledge of their own land. The story of the bee ambush was passed down through generations, becoming part of local legend. For centuries, the people of the Pontic Mountains told their children about the day the bees fought for them, the day Rome learned that even the greatest empire could be humbled by the smallest creatures. And Rome, for its part, never spoke of it again.
The true crisis began not in the gorge, but in the weeks that followed. The survivors of the bee attack had been pulled back to a temporary camp on safer ground, where they were supposed to regroup, resupply, and prepare for a second expedition into the mountains. The tribes, after all, were still unpunished. Rome did not tolerate failure. Orders came from the provincial governor. The legion would return to the mountains, destroy the villages, and prove that the empire could not be defeated by insects. But the soldiers refused. It started quietly. Whispered conversations in the barracks, men sharing their fears, reinforcing one another's trauma. Then it became more open. Soldiers began saying out loud that they would not go back. They would not march into those valleys again. They would not face the bees. The officers responded with threats. Refusal to obey orders was mutiny, punishable by death. Centurions reminded the men of the decimatio, the ancient Roman punishment where every 10th man in a mutinous unit was beaten to death by his comrades. They invoked duty, honor, and the consequences of cowardice. But none of it worked.
Because the fear was too deep. This was not the normal fear of battle, the kind of fear that soldiers learn to manage, to channel, to suppress. This was something primal. The men were not afraid of dying. They were afraid of that death, the helpless, undignified, chaotic death that came from being swarmed by insects. They were afraid of the panic, the loss of control, the humiliation of running while their comrades trampled them. The psychology of an enemy without a face is uniquely corrosive to military morale. Soldiers can steel themselves against human opponents because humans follow patterns. They charge, they retreat, they tire, they die. But bees? Bees are incomprehensible. They come from nowhere. They attack for no reason a soldier can understand. They cannot be intimidated, cannot be negotiated with, cannot be defeated by skill or courage. Facing such an enemy broke something fundamental in the soldier's sense of control. They had been trained to believe that discipline, training, and bravery could overcome any threat. The bee attack proved that belief false. And once that belief shattered, so did their willingness to follow orders. The situation escalated. Small groups of soldiers began deserting, slipping away at night, heading for the coast, hoping to find passage on merchant ships. Others openly declared they would rather face punishment than return to the mountains. Some men became violent, threatening officers who pushed too hard. The camp teetered on the edge of full mutiny. The commanders faced an impossible choice. They could enforce discipline with brutal punishments, but that risked pushing the entire unit into open rebellion. They could try to shame the men into compliance, but shame had already destroyed the unit's morale. They could appeal to reason, but there was no rational argument that could overcome the visceral terror the soldiers felt. In the end, the commanders chose the only option that would not result in bloodshed. They quietly dissolved the remnants of the legion. The survivors were reassigned to other units, spread across multiple legions so that no single unit would carry the stigma of the bee attack. The officers were transferred to different provinces, their careers quietly stalled. The legion's standards were retired and stored in a military archive, never to be displayed again. And the orders to punish the mountain tribes were quietly dropped. Rome moved on, focusing its attention on conflicts that could be won with swords and strategy, not insects.
This dissolution effectively erased the unit from history. There was no official record of its destruction, no memorial, no monument, no entry in the military annals that said Legio X was defeated by bees and subsequently disbanded due to mutiny. Instead, there were gaps, missing units in the records, vague references to losses in Asia Minor, and a conspicuous silence about what happened in the mountains of Pontus. The soldiers themselves carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Some reintegrated into their new units and tried to forget. Others struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and the shame of having survived while their comrades died in chaos. A few became advocates for changes in military tactics, arguing that Rome needed better intelligence about local terrain, better preparation for unconventional warfare, and better support for soldiers who faced psychological trauma. But mostly, they were forgotten. The empire had no use for soldiers who had been defeated by bees. It had no language for discussing psychological wounds, no framework for understanding trauma. Roman culture valued stoicism, courage, and the ability to endure pain without complaint. A soldier who admitted fear was weak. A soldier who refused to fight was a coward. There was no middle ground, no acknowledgement that terror could be legitimate, that some enemies were simply beyond what training could prepare you for.
And so the men who survived the bee attack were left to carry their burden alone. Mocked by their peers, dismissed by their commanders, and erased from history by an empire that could not afford to admit it had been humbled by insects. The mutiny that almost happened, the rebellion that was averted only by quietly disbanding the unit, is a testament to the limits of Roman military discipline. The legions were the most effective fighting force in the ancient world, but they were not invincible. They were made of men, and men can break. When they do, when fear overcomes training and shame replaces pride, even the greatest army in history can fall apart. The bees of the Pontic Mountains did not just defeat a legion. They exposed a truth Rome did not want to face, that power, no matter how great, has limits, that some enemies cannot be conquered by strength alone, and that sometimes the smallest creatures in the world can bring the mightiest empire to its knees.
The story of the bee ambush is almost lost to history, a footnote mentioned in obscure sources, a legend preserved by tribal memory, a disaster so embarrassing that the Roman Empire worked to erase it. But its obscurity does not diminish its significance. In fact, the very act of erasure tells us something profound about Rome. The empire was so obsessed with its image of invincibility that it could not admit when that image was shattered by something as absurd as insects. The bee attack exposes several critical truths about Roman military power, truths that historians often overlook in favor of celebrating Rome's victories. First, it reveals the limits of Roman military supremacy when faced with unconventional warfare. The legions were designed to fight other organized armies, formations that followed predictable patterns, tactics that could be countered with training and discipline. But when faced with guerrilla tactics, with enemies who refused to fight on Rome's terms, the legions struggled. The mountain tribes of Asia Minor understood this instinctively. They knew they could not defeat Rome in open battle, so they did not try. Instead, they used the terrain, their local knowledge, and the natural world itself as weapons. And in doing so, they achieved what few armies ever could. They made Rome retreat.
Second, the incident demonstrates how psychological fear can destroy military discipline more effectively than any weapon. Roman soldiers were trained to withstand physical pain, to march for miles in heavy armor, to fight in brutal conditions, to endure wounds without breaking. But they were not trained to handle the specific terror of being swarmed by insects, of feeling helpless against an enemy that could not be fought, only endured. The bee attack exploited this psychological vulnerability perfectly. It was not the stings themselves that defeated the legion, though they certainly contributed. It was the panic, the loss of control, the collapse of the mental frameworks that soldiers relied on to function in combat. This has broader implications. Throughout history, psychological warfare has often been more decisive than physical violence. Armies have been routed not because they were outthought, but because they were outthought, tricked into panic, demoralized, made to believe they were doomed. The bee attack is an early, extreme example of this principle. The tribesmen did not need to kill every Roman soldier. They just needed to break the legion's cohesion, to turn disciplined troops into a fleeing mob. Once that happened, the battle was over.
Third, the bee attack highlights Rome's vulnerability in hostile terrain where local knowledge dominates. Roman military doctrine assumed that Rome would always have superior logistics, better intelligence, and the ability to impose its preferred battlefield conditions. But in the mountains of Asia Minor, none of that was true. The tribes knew every valley, every pass, every cliff face. They knew where the bees nested, they knew how to provoke them, and they knew exactly where to lure the Romans to maximize the chaos. Rome's advantages, armor, discipline, numbers, meant nothing in that context. This pattern would repeat throughout Roman history. The legions struggled in forests, where dramatic tribes could ambush them from cover. They struggled in deserts, where Parthian cavalry could outmaneuver them. They struggled in mountains, where local defenders turned geography into a weapon. The bee attack is an extreme example, but it fits a larger pattern. Rome was most vulnerable when fighting on its enemy's terms, in environments where Roman advantages did not apply.
Fourth, the incident serves as a fascinating case study in ancient biological warfare. Primitive, yes, but shockingly effective. The use of animals and environmental factors as weapons was not unique to the Pontic tribes, but their execution was brilliant. They understood that bees, when properly provoked, were more than just a nuisance. They were a force multiplier. A single swarm could create more chaos than 100 archers. And because the bees were wild, because they could not be captured or controlled after the attack, there was no way for Rome to retaliate in kind. This raises an interesting question. Why did other enemies of Rome not adopt similar tactics? Part of the answer is probably practical. Not every region had aggressive bee species, and not every culture had the knowledge required to weaponize them. But part of the answer is also psychological. Most of Rome's enemies wanted to defeat the legions in honorable combat, to prove their own martial superiority. Using bees felt like a trick, a coward's tactic. The Pontic tribes, pragmatic and desperate, did not care about honor. They cared about survival. And their lack of concern for conventional honor gave them a strategic advantage.
Fifth, the bee attack reveals why historians have almost ignored the incident: embarrassment, fragmentary evidence, and absurdity. Roman historians were not neutral observers. They were propagandists, tasked with celebrating Rome's glory and minimizing its failures.
A disaster like the bee attack did not fit the narrative. It made Rome look foolish. So it was buried, mentioned only in passing, if at all. The tribes who won the battle had no written tradition to preserve their victory. And later historians, working from incomplete sources, dismissed the story as too absurd to be credible. But absurdity does not mean falsehood. History is full of bizarre incidents, events so strange that they seem fictional but are, upon investigation, entirely real. The bee attack is one of these. It happened. It destroyed a Roman unit, and the fact that it has been forgotten for centuries does not make it any less significant. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the bee attack exposes the human side of Rome's legions, their fear, their pride, their trauma, and their vulnerability. Roman soldiers were not automatons. They were not invincible. They were men, subject to the same psychological and emotional forces as anyone else. They could be brave, but they could also panic. They could endure incredible hardship, but they could also break. They could conquer the world, but they could also be defeated by bees.
This human dimension is often lost in discussions of Roman military history. We talk about tactics, logistics, and strategy, the mechanics of warfare. We celebrate victories and analyze defeats. But we rarely talk about what it felt like to be a Roman soldier, to face the terror of combat, to carry the trauma of survival. The bee attack, for all its absurdity, is a window into that experience. It shows us what happens when training fails, when discipline collapses, when fear overwhelms everything else. The legacy of the bee attack is not glorious. It is not the stuff of epic poetry or triumphal monuments, but it is real. It reminds us that history is not just the story of great men and great victories. It is also the story of chaos, failure, and the strange, unpredictable ways that power can be undermined. It reminds us that empires, no matter how mighty, are fragile, vulnerable to threats they never anticipated, defeated by enemies they never took seriously, and it reminds us that sometimes, in the long, complex story of human civilization, the smallest creatures can change everything.
The Romans marched into the mountains of Asia Minor, expecting to crush a rebellion. Instead, they were crushed by bees. The legion vanished, not in a single dramatic battle, but in a slow, humiliating erasure from the historical record. The soldiers who survived carried their trauma in silence. The tribes who won celebrated in obscurity. And Rome, the greatest empire in history, learned a lesson it would never admit, that even the most powerful force in the world can be brought down by something as small, as simple, and as unstoppable as a swarm.